we think if we share this really cool strategic and creative idea, that it will automatically be accepted by the most rational parts of our listener or our audience or our decision maker's brain. And it doesn't work that way. All of us have a built-in spam filter. Often it's not really that the designs or the creative is really bad. What I find is that our ability to package it and break through the spam filter is really underutilized, or we don't invest much in how we do that.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Church Circle podcast, season 2. And this is the first episode we've ever done where we've got a guest from season 1 back for another episode. And very excited today to have CJ Alvarado back. He spoke last time on something called Winning the Room, the strategy behind that. And we want to dive a little bit more into that today, talk about some of the psychology behind that. We're going to get technical and just talk about some other tips and tricks that you can implement into your life to help build the trust and the communication skills that you need to work with leaders, to work with volunteers, whatever it may be. So it's going to be a good conversation. I'm excited for CJ to be back. We had such positive feedback from the last episode that it was a no-brainer to bring him back. And so thanks for joining us, CJ. And maybe just for people who didn't watch the last episode, and if they haven't, you should go and check that out. But if they haven't listened to it yet, what kind of what do you do on a day-to-day that kind of has made you an expert in this field?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me back, and thanks to your community of folks. Everybody was super positive, and it's great to know that there was some value there. So thanks for having me back. So I've worked in marketing pretty much my whole career, and I started my first company when I was 19 years old. Thought that would be the coolest thing to do. Knew nothing about business. It failed, but it got me kind of into the whole mode of it all. And then, I started another one in my 20s with kind of a different perspective. And that one was part of an acqui-hire where we went and worked for one of the largest music technology companies in the world, made a software called Pro Tools. The company was called DigiDesign. And so I worked in corporate in marketing for them and marketing my whole career. The cool thing is that along the way, I got opportunities to also work with the church. So I feel like I've had a foot in the marketplace, but also a foot in the church space, which has made it really, really fun for me.
Yeah, I think for those of you who don't know CJ, I really want you to go and listen to the last episode because it was 30 something minutes of just pure gold. Everything that he was saying was just hitting the mark. And so I think CJ often, I think is one of those names that flies under the radar just because of a lot of what you do is behind the scenes. But I think I'm glad that we're able to give you the opportunity to kind of just share more about what you've learned, because it's not something that is necessarily just read about. It's something that's also that you've had to implement into your own life. And that's kind of and when we talk about winning the room, it's not just about reading books and quoting them. It's about you're in those scenarios where you're in those board meetings, you're in those rooms with leaders and pastors, and you've had to work out what's the best way to actually build trust and to find a connection with them that goes beyond just a leader and a client, or a leader and a volunteer, whatever it may be. It goes beyond that to build something that's actually harmonious. And so when we talk about winning the room, maybe just very briefly summarize what that is, and we'll kind of introduce this idea of the crocodile brain in a second.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, to your point, I've been with a lot of creatives. I've worked as a creative. I was an art major, and have worked with creatives my whole life. I've been a creative, and I've understood how frustrating it can be to do all this great work with your team, be so excited about it, have a point of view on it. And then you take this idea and you take it into this, space. And it's very different experiences for a lot of people, but oftentimes they lose the room. People are looking at their phones. They walk out, they cut your time, they're late, and it's a really difficult situation. And so I've worked with a lot of creatives who are really frustrated with that experience. Some just wrote it off and said it would never get better. I instead have kind of spent time going, well, this is so much a part of the creative practice that is so understated that there has to be a different way. And so it's kind of like out of necessity, really, Reuben. This wasn't trying to be cool. It was just like, how can I get my team's ideas to break through the noise so we can actually create an impact, right? Like that's literally what has been the motivation for all of this.
Yeah. And you talk about breaking through the noise. And I think this kind of
Yeah.
leads us well into this conversation of the crocodile brain, because this is kind of where it starts, right? There is, and I kind of want you to explain this because you'll do a much better job than I will, but it's this idea of the first impression that we make, and that first conversation or the first thing we pitch, there is a protective barrier almost in someone's brain that says, is this information that I should listen to, or is that information I should just reject? And so our first hurdle is getting past the crocodile brain, right? So maybe just explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So there's this idea that like message sent is not message received, right? We can talk, but it doesn't mean that's landed in the mind of the decision maker, nor has it hit in a way for them to want to inspire the kind of action we need, whether that's an approval on a design campaign or a marketing campaign or some initiative, right? So message sent does not equal message received. So what are the things that stand in the way of message being received, right? And it starts with kind of this fundamental understanding about how our brains work. And common, like popular neuroscience and psychology would describe the human brain in like 3 sections, just to keep it real simple. And they call it the triune brain. It breaks up into this amygdala, or what people call the crocodile or reptilian brain, the limbic system, and then the neocortex. The crocodile brain is the part of our brain that's basically like, when is this over? When's lunch? It's concerned about survival. It's concerned with like novelty. It's the part of us that responds very quickly to the kinds of interactions that we have in life. If someone calls you and says, hey, can I have 2 minutes of your time? And it's a spam call, it's a part of you that goes no and wants to hang up, right? The limbic system of the brain is the part that processes a lot of like our emotions, our social bonds, things like that. And then finally, the neocortex is the bigger part of our brain. That's what does all the strategic thinking. It processes language, math, all of these things. Most people think, okay, we're here with our creative team building out all this stuff, and we're using the neocortex and all parts of our brain. We think if we share this really cool strategic and creative idea, that it will automatically be accepted by the most rational parts of our listener or our audience or our decision maker's brain. And it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. All of us have a built-in spam filter. And your leaders and your decision makers, they have a military grade spam filter. And so what I find, Reuben, is that often it's not really that the designs or the creative is really bad. What I find is that our ability to package it and break through the spam filter is really underutilized, or we don't invest much in how we do that. And so the way to think about the crocodile brain is basically like this. It functions in this way. If it's not dangerous, ignore it. If it's not new and exciting, ignore it. If it's new, summarize it as quickly as possible and forget about the details. And lastly, don't send anything up to the neocortex, the part of the brain that does all the rational thinking and problem solving, unless you have a situation that's, unexpected or out of the ordinary. This describes how a lot of people would describe their senior pastor, their senior leader, right? And it's no knock on anyone.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that spam filter is there to protect our attention because it's so finite, right? And we only have so much attention that we can give things. So that's generally how the crocodile brain works and why it's there.
Yeah, I told you we were getting deep into psychology today, and I think it's
Sorry,
really good.
Bill.
No, it's great. It's great because I think quite often, like you said, we put things down to. We can often, especially with the leaders and when there's emotions attached and stuff, we can always say like, oh, it's just because they don't like me, or it's because they don't like my idea. And we put the emotional attachment to it. But when you start to think about this and like you said, the military grade, I was going to ask you actually, do you think that the higher capacity leader has a larger part of the crocodile brain? And I think what you've basically already answered is yes. And I think that idea is if we can understand how the brain is wired in these situations, well, our approach will then match up to how we can most effectively navigate this system. Now,
yes,
I guess there is a balance to be struck, right? Because we obviously want to dumb stuff down and make it as easy to understand to get through the crocodile brain and get past that filter. But then we also need to make sure that our answers are compelling enough and there's enough ideation and thought behind it to when it gets to the neocortex, is actually something that can be processed and analyzed and thought about. So how do you balance those two things? Like, especially when you're looking at practically on a pitch deck or something like that, like obviously we've got to come in and be sharp and get to the point. But at the same time, we've got to be willing to unpack this. How do you balance those two things?
Great question. I feel like our ideas have the best chance when we communicate in straight lines and not in circles, right? So, what I mean by that is that it's not so much about dumbing our ideas down as much as it is about tightening them up. It's very easy to walk into a room. These decision makers are inundated with information, right? There's already information overload. I haven't met one executive, Reuben, that at the end of the day is like, you know what? I can do one more meeting. I can take some
Yeah.
more calls. No, they're inundated. So when we come into the room and we just start verbally processing, most people think because I've been talking since I was 2 years old, I'm pretty good at it. But the truth is, when you're dealing in the room with decision makers, it's a completely different ballgame. You have to learn how to shoot a straight line right to them in a way that gets them to perk up, listen, and then process your idea. It helps them kind of feel like it's worth the time. I think about a painkiller, right? There's a lot of medicine or vitamins or whatever that goes in the capsule itself. It's been sourced somewhere. There's a lot of work and people and process that's gone into synthesizing it and to make it something that actually solves a problem or a pain. And then finally, it's put into a capsule so that it's easily digested. A lot of times we sit and we chat with folks. I listen to them. It's like 10, 15 minutes in, and we really don't know what is it you want? What is it you need? What is the heart of what you're trying to say? That's how you lose the room. That's talking kind of in circles, right? And so when we can step into the room and we can just give them, the pain or the problem that this is going to solve, preferably one that they really care about, that's when you really start to see something different. So, I used to tell people in the church world, for example, like, you're not just pitching a design for a sermon series. You're pitching a design for a sermon series that's going to fill the room, that's going to reach masses, right? That's going to affect, right? So that's a whole different approach into how I might talk about something like that.
Yeah, in the last episode, and this is why I really want whoever's listening to go back and listen to this. We talk about the what, so what, and now what approach, right? So those three things of the person. In order to keep progressing in the conversation, you've got to have those three things worked out. But what are some common pitfalls that you've, even just on a practical note, what are some of the pitfalls that you've identified in these scenarios that when you're trying to influence a leader or help or trying to get them to be more involved in the decision making? What are some of the pitfalls that you've seen that people have made where it's kind of not really worked out?
Yeah. So one, like I said, they tend to get with leaders, and we tend unconsciously to see leaders not just as humans, but as a role. So we think they can solve all things, right? But their capacity is limited too. And so we tend to just project a lot of energy. That's the one thing that a lot of leaders will go, oh, let me talk to their managers. And so they have a translator of sorts between you now and them, right? To try to help keep the cognitive load low. That's how you lose the room, and you don't stay in the room that way. Right. And so we don't kind of emotionally regulate and try to put what it is we're trying to say, in very simple terms, and then have all the supporting data, behind it. So there's that. The other things too, though, is that oftentimes humans do some funny things when they get in the room with really influential people. They tend to kind of flatter or not really share exactly what they feel about a particular thing. And so I would tell folks, hey, don't be nice, be instrumental, right? And it's not to say be a jerk, right? That's not it, but focus on instrumentality. When you get in a room with decision makers, they're so busy, they're moving so quick, they're mature enough. Usually if they're leading an organization, they have to be, somewhat resilient and emotional, mature enough to be able to handle the stuff. So by us just being nice, we blend into the noise. But if you can demonstrate your usefulness to them, then all of a sudden they hone in on you. I watched a room one time where a bunch of young leaders were invited in to speak on some stuff, share some ideas on some issues, with the organization. And they all kind of played it cool. They played it nice. And I was like, wow, this is your opportunity to really share your ideas. The ideas you share pretty plainly in the hallway. But in the room, it wasn't really there because they wanted to flatter. They wanted to be liked. And I get it. I totally get it. It's a self-preservation thing, right? But I always say focus on instrumentality and usefulness. What's the problem these guys are trying to solve? And then how can my efforts or my team help solve those things?
It sounds like we quite often let our emotions get in the way of these things and how we feel about a certain thing. So when we go into the room, is their body language approving what I'm saying? Do they like me already? Yeah. Or even just, having those thoughts about how I'm perceived. But if you can kind of, what you're saying is if you can kind of narrow that down to being, am I being instrumental? Then everything else, if that can be the priority, then everything else can come second in terms of how you evaluate stuff. But in regards to that, so that sounds like emotional intelligence is quite an important part of this process, because you have to be able to move some of that emotion to the side, but also it's in terms of reading someone else, you have to be okay with maybe picking up the wrong thoughts and digesting that in a certain way. Does that make sense? So how important is emotional intelligence in this, and how can you develop our own emotional intelligence to be able to handle this better in the future?
Yeah, EQ is so important because we can misinterpret our leaders who are moving fast. They tend to be pretty efficient with their communication, which means they're direct. They're not really thinking about people's tender sensibilities at times, right? So that can be misinterpreted. And so it does require us to be, more emotionally mature and regulated with it. How do we do that? Like, I think you start with really understanding this is about solving problems and sometimes complex problems. So let's kind of get our identity out of this whole thing, right? How do I best understand what are the challenges? Ask more questions, deploy your curiosity, in those moments. And then, at the same time, try to decouple your identity, with how people are responding. Because if they respond a certain way, you're going to feel great. And then if they ignore you or say it's a bad idea, you're going to feel, crappy. And that's a really awful way to kind of go through life, right? Having this roller coaster of ups and downs. Whereas
Sure.
if we can kind of stay objective, I find that just in terms of longevity and overall enjoyment, it's just an easier way to go in this game.
Are you ready to take your church leadership to the next level? Then it's time to join Church Circle, a vibrant community where church leaders, staff, and creatives come together to share ideas, tackle challenges, and grow in their ministries. Say goodbye to getting lost in the noise of endless social media groups, and hello to a space where your voice is valued and your struggles are met with unwavering support and inspiration. Church Circle is more than just another online community. It's a place where you can connect with like-minded individuals who truly understand the unique challenges of church leadership. Ready to experience the difference? Head to churchcircle.com and sign up today. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit here, because I think one of the things we did touch on in the last episode was about trust and building trust. And I think a lot of people got, opened that door, but maybe we need to kind of unpack that a little bit more in terms of how do we build trust? Because I think all of this conversation all comes back to when we're building that relationship, it's about, can the leader trust me enough to get this done? And do I trust the leader's opinion and what they think or their feedback to the point that I know this is the right direction to head in? So maybe we can just kind of shift gears a little bit. I saw you've got on your Substack. I've got your Substack here. If you don't follow CJ on Substack, it's Take New Ground. Go and check that out. But his most recent post is about trust. And you quote Stephen M.R. Covey quite a lot in this, and he's got some really good thoughts on trust. But one of the things he says is that trust always affects two outcomes, speed and cost. And so when trust goes down, speed will also go down and cost will go up. And I think what's interesting about this is that quite often when we talk about being efficient and when we talk about getting stuff done, we really focus on the workload side of things. So how quickly I get this task done. But one of the ways that we can actually speed up and be efficient in these scenarios is by building trust, so that there's less friction between us and the decision maker, right? So maybe we can just kind of unpack some of those strategies for building long-term trust and credibility with the leadership. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic and one I'm having a lot of conversations around right now. I think that it's easy to feel like, hey, I need people to trust my creative opinion, my creative direction, my insights, my preference, whatever it is. But trust is tricky. It's fragile, right? And so what I like to do is try to first start by how people much smarter than me have defined trust. It's made up of character, who you are, your values, can we trust you, things like that, right? But also competence. So you can be the nicest person in an organization, but obviously if I'm not getting results or I'm not understanding the problem that is being placed before me to solve, and so there isn't alignment there, well, that trust is going to waver, right? And so really it's important for us to make sure that we've got both. make sure that, yes, we're people who, are kind and trustworthy and stuff, but also that we're getting results, plain and simple. Because like I mentioned earlier, instrumentality is really all, decision makers and influencers kind of care about. Right. And so trying to find that balance is great. In back in the Silicon Valley, I had a mentor who said, he always tends to hire people, and when he hires them, they always start with like a 90 points trust score. Imagine like a little number above their head on a scale of 1 to 100. They all start with 90 points. And so he's giving them trust. He's empowering them. He wants them to go kind of do what they do. But some won't pay attention to the competence side. And so that trust score kind of drops. Maybe they're late on deadlines. Maybe they go into the room and they share an idea that was totally off the mark or the goal, right? And so that trust score can go down. What's important for us is to understand it can go back up, right? And that's cool. But we really need to understand that it's made up of those two things.
Yeah. And so let's say, because I've been in this position before where, I don't know if it's just my personality type or whether it's a big area of improvement, but I'll say, yeah, I can do this by this date, and I miss it, right? And that becomes a pattern and a trend. And then my leadership or whoever's above me is now expecting me to fail before I've even started, right? Or we're starting on the back foot. So someone like me in that position, how do you start to change the narrative and start to like change the outcome of this? Obviously, you can just say, well, build trust, but what does it actually look like to start to change perceptions? Because I imagine this is a long-term thing. You can't just do this in a couple of days.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. And that perception is important. It's important to note that whether it's a missed deadline or we just, missed the objective or the heart of what we were trying to do, people tend to treat you the way they think about you, not the way you think about you, right? And so if they start to think he's always late or she just doesn't get it, I don't care how good of a person you are or how hard you think you work, you're going to have a whole other side of the room who's going to start to treat you the way they think about you. And so it's really important to know those perceptions, not to try to people please. That's not what we're going after here. It's really about impact. And so to create the right kind of impact for you and maybe even your teams, we have to be aware what perceptions are floating around there, right? And that perception is going to drive that trust. All of us miss deadlines. All of us are going to make mistakes. We're not going to hit grand slams every time, right? Or home runs every time. So I find the best thing is just to come right out, acknowledge it, when those things happen, so that we can signal we're aware of this, we're taking accountability. All great leaders, miss the mark, right? So that's not really a big surprise to people. The other thing is to be very intentional that whatever work you're going to present or do, that you first demonstrate that you understand what problem it's solving. And let me just tell you a quick story. So this was when I was in the Bay Area working for DigiDesign. We were going to do this big marketing campaign, and we had to do a big presentation on this. And we started out, we were so excited about our presentation. The slides were amazing. The design was awesome. All the product stuff was super cool. We were so excited as a creative team. We got in there with the CFO and a lot of the other, C-suite leaders. And they were there kind of like arms folded. No one seemed excited. The presentation fell totally flat. And I lost the room. So I went back. I was like, okay, guys, we got to sweeten up this deck and presentation. Let's make this thing even better. Let's blow their socks off, man. Came back, man. It was even more slick, Reuben, right? And I thought, for sure, this is going to get them. Because
it was animated and you had the star wipe right, exactly. On the slides. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, baby. I was going for it. And same response. Finally, I was just so frustrated thinking these guys don't care. These guys are toxic. This company, hates creatives, all the things, right?
Yeah.
And I had a buddy of mine go like, hey, I think you just need to do a better job aligning what you're doing in the marketing creative side with the business goals. And so I really agreed with that. It was hard to hear, but I agreed with it. And so we made one simple tweak. We went into the next round to pitch it again. And before I started, I said, hey, before we get started, I want you guys to know everything you're about to see and all of this work we've put into is to try to accomplish one objective, and that's raise revenue by 20%. All of a sudden, the CFO perked up. See, he had this perception that said these creative folks don't care about the real goals and outcomes of this business. That perception led to a lack of trust that slowed everything down. And the moment I could just speak to the problem he felt was most important, as well as the CEO, the whole thing changed. Right. And so sometimes it's as simple as that. right? And other times it takes a little bit more time and effort to keep driving the right point home. But all in all, it's kind of the same process, you know?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, in terms of, you talk about perceptions and these leaders, these people, these, as you said, C-suite people or whoever it may be, they've built a perception. But what if you're not aware, very self-aware, and you go into these rooms and it's not working out the way you want it to? How do you understand what people's perception is of you? So, for example, you had a buddy of yours say to you, "Look, this is maybe what you're doing wrong." But what if, either you don't have that, or you're trying to feel out kind of what do other people think about me? Because I think there's that balance of, this can be a very anxiety inducing thing when you're starting to think about, and it can make you quite what's the word, aware, self-aware, but in an anxious way, self-conscious. Yes. There we go. And so you're going through that feeling of, okay, what do they think about me? And that can kind of cause some fear. How do you do that in a emotionally intelligent way, where you go and say, I understand there's a perception here, or I'm identifying the perception and I'm not going to let that affect me?
Yeah. I use an acronym called LAND, LAND. And LAND stands for, the L stands for listen. Perceptions fly around everywhere. Hey, Reuben, can you go talk to those decision makers? They listen to you. That's a perception. Yeah. Right. Or every time I go in that room, they don't listen. They'll listen to CJ though. Like, that's a perception. Or, hey, CJ, he's a really hard worker, but he's nice. That's a perception. What does that really mean? That might mean he's a hard worker, but probably don't put him in a leadership position because he's too nice. Right. So we have these perceptions flying around. So it's like radio frequencies. Just because you're not tuned into them doesn't mean they're there. They're there. Sure. You just kind of have to find the right frequency and tune in and listen. So try to start listening every day to what you hear. You'll hear it about others. You hear about yourself, perhaps. If you can't listen or you don't hear a lot, then ask. That's the A in the acronym. Just go ask. Ask 3 people that you enjoy working with and they enjoy working with you, and say, hey, what's it like working on the other side of me? I like to ask that. Or I'll ask this other one. When you think about certain brands, Louis Vuitton or Nike, some things come to mind. When you think of CJ and you think of Reuben, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And make them answer quickly. They might say very creative, or really hardworking, or creative but scattered, right? That's a perception. Yeah. Then go ask 3 people. That's what they'll say about me. Go ask 3 people that you don't necessarily get along with, right? You're probably not going to hang out after work, and ask them the same question. See what feedback they give you and see if that matches up with your perception of yourself. Oftentimes we think we're hardworking, creative, and strategic, and others might think you're creative but lack communication and something else. And so the N stands for navigating those differences, right? Oh gosh, I didn't know this is what the perception was. I need to change that, right? What is the perception I actually want to put out there? And it should be authentic to you. We're not trying to be salesy here or disingenuous. It's got to be authentic to you. So you navigate that. And then finally, D is for demonstrate. Now you have to demonstrate what you're all about over and over and over again. So for me, my 3 things that 3 attributes that I really want to drive home all the time is that, yes, he's a creative, but he's strategic, meaning like I understand the business goals or the church goals or whatever it is. And then third, I'm empathetic. For me, those are the 3 things that are really important to me. I don't want to be such a hard driver that people can't feel like I'm accessible. I don't want to be so creative that leaders don't think I get it, right? So those are the 3 things that I'm constantly trying to demonstrate to people. I think even if you're not totally intuitive or super self-aware, you can run through that process and get some good data for yourself.
That's great. Listen, ask, navigate, and don't tell me demonstrate. It was demonstrate. I had it in my head until that very moment in time. No, that's great. I think that's really practical because you're right. There are different people that have different levels of self-awareness, right? And sometimes you just need something that's objective that goes, this is actually where we're at. And you need to reflect that against who you are, especially when you balance egos as well. And creatives have big egos, whether we like it or not. It's those things of saying, okay, well, let's check this against what I think of myself, not to bring ourselves down necessarily, but to chip away at the things that aren't meant to be there, and for us to actually recognize, what do people perceive us as, and what are we actually to people in our relationships. These are great thoughts, and I'm so glad we got to dive into this a little bit more. because I think even those little tools we just talked about are going to be super helpful for people in churches, but also in workplaces and so forth. So anything you want to share, like anything else you want to just hit us with, even if it's a hot take or anything like that you can think of as we wrap up?
Yeah. I mean, on the perception thing, and we may have talked a little bit about it, I think it's really important for creatives to look at the perception, because often that's in the room before you ever get in there, right? And so the perception of me, I can't be in every meeting, I can't be in every phone call or Zoom, right? And so often what's in the room is the perception of you. And so that's why it's really important to know what it is, because again, it's working for you or it's working against you. And so it's a much more impactful career in ministry if you know you've been really intentional with kind of who you are, what you want to be about, and then you've been on top of when that perception kind of, veers off course. So a lot of benefit to that.
As you were talking, it kind of reminds me of how you smell, right? Like when you walk into a room, like how do people smell you? And sometimes you can think you think you smell worse than you do. And everyone's like, no, you don't smell bad. And sometimes you think you smell better than you do. And then everyone's like, oh, this guy stinks. And there's different times of your life where you smell worse and you smell better. And there's different things you can do to smell better or smell worse. And it kind of reminds me of that, of like, everyone's got a perception of whether you stink or not. It's kind of like you understanding, okay, do I smell or do I not smell? And what can I do to change that? Totally. So that's how I'm picturing it now. So I'm going to start asking.
Our mouth is this close to our nose, right? And sometimes we don't smell what's going to go right. And
exactly.
So it's very much like, yeah. It's interesting.
So I'm going to start asking myself now, do I stink? And that's my metric.
I love it.
All right, man. Well,
that to the list of questions.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, maybe we can come up with an acronym for smell. I'll have a think about it.
Forget land. It's going to be stink.
Yeah.
We'll just
there you go. Stink. Yeah. All right, that's our new one. Well, CJ, I know you've got a book hopefully coming out this year, which we mentioned in the last podcast. Kind of let us know how that's going. Are we nearly there?
Yeah, we're working on it, man. We're almost there. Full rough draft is almost there, called Win the Room. And so it's really just a lot of what we've talked about, try to help people make the most that they can. When we talk about winning the room, a lot of times it's been talked about in a really Machiavellian way. I don't want to do that. I don't want this to be like sleazy and using power in manipulative ways. It's really about how do we take our authentic selves and just be the most impactful person we can, knowing what we know about humans, psychology standpoint, and all of that, and just being as effective as we can. So we're almost there, man. I'm really excited.
I'm excited. I mean, I don't want to have to put a date on it, but can you kind of give us a hint of how soon, or is it something that we should just wait till next year for?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a next year thing, but this year is to get the whole book kind of rough draft submitted and edited, and probably for a release early next year.
Sweet. Well, we'll make sure that we'll keep people updated on that. And cool. if you guys want to know more about what CJ's up to, you can follow him. It's at CJ Alvarado, right, on most social channels. Yeah, so you can keep up to date with him on how that book launch is going as well. I'll be keeping in the loop, and I'll definitely be picking up a copy because there's a few things that I need to tweak up and change in this area. So I'm excited, and I'm glad you're finally putting your wisdom and knowledge that you've learned over these years into some paper form so people can take it with them and learn. So it's great. We need more good writers in the world. So I'm glad you're doing it.
Love it. Thanks, bro.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining. If you've enjoyed this podcast, send it to someone that you know will be impacted by it, and also leave us a review, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Leave us a comment or like it on YouTube as well, where we are in video form. And we look forward to seeing you on another episode of the Church Circle podcast. Thanks again, CJ, for joining, and we'll see you guys soon.